Beautiful. Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're super excited that y'all are joining us after that fire of a panel and this great DJ. You are in the Structural Democracy Reform Breakout, and we're super excited to engage in a conversation around how do we actually talk about and get to the roots of the structural democracy one side of how do we think of demands that address the root kind of inadequacies of that system and how do we fight for a better system. And so my name is Marbre Stahly-Butts. I'm with Law for Black Lives. I use she and her pronouns, and I am joined by Amna Akbar, who is a professor at Ohio State University and a law professor. And we're super excited to dig in with y'all. We kind of have three main goals for a half an hour together and really hope that it's an interactive time. And so encourage folks to put questions in the chat. If you have points of clarification, ideas, thoughts that you want to talk about, please do hit us up and holler. All goals for the next kind of half an hour are threefold. First, we want to kind of talk about the roots of US democracy and the ways in which it is both insufficient and corrupt. And that understanding will help us shape demands for kind of radical reforms for democracy. Secondly, we want to zoom out and kind of expand our understanding of what we mean by democratic reforms. So very often it's a very myopic kind of conversation about just voting or not voting, but in fact, it means a lot more than that. So we're going to zoom out for a second and then talk a bit about what are the spectrum of demands that we might be able to engage with that would build power and move us towards a transformation in our democratic systems. And so that's next half an hour. And again, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat. We'll get those and we'll try our best to address them. So welcome. So I'm going to start really quickly by talking a bit about democracy in the United States. And that's going to be kind of about the institutional history of our democracy and all the ways in which it's been exclusionary and elite in many ways. And so I think many of us Black and brown folks have an experience of democracy that feels very exclusionary. Much of that comes from long histories of voter suppression that we've seen throughout the country, as well as things like poor taxes, binging of voter rolls that we saw, for instance, in Georgia in 2018. And so we all kind of have this sense that democracy in the US is stacked. And although it's true that all of the institutions in the United States, whether that's the criminal legal system, the educational system, have roots in slavery and in indigenous genocide and theft, I think the electoral system is in some ways unique in that almost every single system that leads to elections, that supports elections, is deeply, deeply ingrained in an attempt by our founders and kind of white supremacists and white slave owners in the South to maintain their power. And so we see this, I think, first and most obviously in who was granted the right to vote. And so very early in our democracy, only white landowners could vote. At some point, white male landowners, at some point, kind of white men of different cloaks could vote. But it really has only in the last 40 or 50 years that Black people, women, other Black and brown folks have been able to exercise the franchise. And so that's the most obvious way in which our democracy has been and remains exclusionary. But actually our democracy at its roots is deeply, deeply elitist and exclusionary. And so the institutions that make up democracy, the Congress, the Senate, the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court, all of these are really, I think, manifestations and monuments to white supremacy. And so as many of us know, congressional representation was really a compromise that was meant to placate white slave owners. And so white slave owners had a fundamental problem. They wanted to count the power of the Black population while refusing Black enslaved people the right to vote or make decisions. And so as many of us know, out of this dilemma, in a compromise between white slave owners of the South and white male elite of the North, came the 3/5 compromise. And this compromise allowed white slave owners to count Black people as 3/5 of human beings. And so allowed them to exploit not only our labor, but also our vote. But it still meant that white slave owners in the South were underrepresented or did not have full representation because it was only 60%. And so because of that, they invented the Senate, where every single state, regardless of population, received 2 votes. And as a result of this, white slave owners were incredibly overrepresented in comparison to their populations, and also, again, allowed them to exploit the Black vote and the Black populations. This is still true today for a number of reasons. The representation scheme in the Senate and the Congress still benefits white people across the country. Number one, because white folks tend to live in rural areas. And this is not an accident, of course. The lack of availability of loans for Black farmers and Black people, the stark racism that have pushed Black folks to urban areas, all of these have resulted in rural areas being overwhelmingly white. And as a result, white folks, for instance, in Dakota, Wyoming, Alaska, and Vermont, roughly 2.7 million people, have the same electoral power as 110 million people living in California, Texas, Florida, and New York, which we know are much more diverse states. And so we see continuing the legacy of these institutions that really overpowers and overrepresents white votes as compared to Black folks and brown folks across the country. The Electoral College really re-entrenches these inadequacies and these disparities by using the same numbers of representatives that are awarded to folks in Congress and the Senate to be your Electoral College vote. And so we see the exact same inadequacies and the exact same kind of racist tendencies recreated in the Electoral College system, which of course elects the president. And this is a system that's been challenged really since its inception. It really was a hard push by the Southern white landowners to make sure they had power, both in terms of the executive branch and in terms of the congressional branch. And so we see over and over again the ways in which these institutions were not only based inside of slavery in that moment, but were created to maintain white power and continue to do so because of the long, long histories of racism that have driven Black and brown people to urban areas, and then an electoral system that over-rewards rural areas. The winner-take-all system also further entrenches white power because a lot of Black folks, as we know, live in the South. But because of winner-take-all, Southern states are often awarded to the Republican candidate. And so again, we see the diluting of Black votes over and over again, and not on accident, but through kind of a purposeful, intentional, long-standing system that is meant to do that and was meant to over-award white power. The Supreme Court, I think, is another example in that, number one, the Supreme Court is affirmed by the Senate, which, as we know, is overrepresentative of white rural areas, but also it has overseen voter disenfranchisement of Black and brown people and of women for literally generations. And it's seen that over and over again, and has been an overwhelmingly majority white male court throughout its history. And so we see how all these institutions were not only created to maintain white supremacy, but continue to do so today. And I think that acknowledging kind of the racist roots of this system are essential in crafting demands that address the full problem that we see in terms of how incredibly unequal our democracy remains and how tilted it remains towards elitism, towards white, and towards the rich. Next slide. The other kind of major issue with our democracy that we see that has come up really in the last few decades, especially, but always was true, is the place of money inside of our democracy. And so we see the interference and the persistence of corporate interest in our politics in a number of ways. One is through donations. And so we know that, for instance, the recent Senate race in Georgia was $500 million race. $500 million went into electing two candidates in one race in Georgia just last month. And so we have, or this month. So we have this sense of how much money is being poured, and it's very often corporate interests who pour that money in. And we see corporate interests really spending on both sides of the aisle, right? So they give the Democrats and they give to Republicans. They really stack, I think, the race in many ways. And so big companies have oversized power in Washington, D.C. and in our state capitals across the country. And we can really see this in the decisions of our electeds, for instance, to bail out big corporate interests while kind of average folks are struggling, starving, homeless, housing unstable. And so the bailouts of 2008 and then recently the COVID-19 bailouts are just one example or two examples of the way that our elected officials are constantly choosing corporations over people. And that, of course, is a product of the system that allows for really deep penetration of money into all the facets of our democracy. I think it's important to note, and this is the next slide, that there have been chances kind of throughout history for us to rethink what democracy might look like, how it might be more inclusive. And I think W.E.B. Du Bois and Angela Davis talk about abolition democracy. They say that following slavery, there was really a demand by both those who were formerly enslaved, as well as kind of radical Republicans, to remake the institutions that allowed for the unequal rights distribution that we saw throughout the country. And there was really a decision by kind of the power-holding elite, and especially with the Compromise of 1876, to end Reconstruction, not to actually touch any of the institutions that allowed for, that encouraged, that perpetuated slavery, and to not address those. And so we saw a denial, a refusal to really remake democracy in the image of freedom after the Civil War. And as a result, every single institution that is now in place really really has its roots pre the Civil War and continues to perpetuate the power inequities and hierarchies that were in place. I think the other thing that kind of post-Civil War teaches us is that democracy is impossible without reparations and without radical reforms. That if people can't eat, if they're not free to control their own labor, if they cannot kind of guarantee their substance or their safety, that it's impossible for them to participate in a franchise such as democracy. And so I think there's a lot of lessons in the post-Civil War era that tell us about how we actually have to transform our whole system to think about democratic reforms. And I think Amna's going to touch a bit on that, kind of zooming out.
Yeah, thanks, Marbre. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I just wanted to take a minute to pause in contrast to the kind of the history that Marbre was providing, kind of what the experience is and why it might feel deeply dissatisfying to vote these days, right? It's like one of those things is that, or the narrowness of the concept of democracy as well. So normally in US public discourse, like in the mainstream, the word democracy is used in such a really narrow way. It's thought of as referring to voting, going to the ballot box once every 2 years, once every 4 years. Often it's even so narrow that it's only focused on the question or the voting for the president, right? So even putting aside people in Congress or in various local office. And so the kind of idea of democracy is about voting. It's going to the ballot box once every 2 or 4 years. And then when you go to vote, we have this two-party system that's dominated, as Marbre was explaining, by the billionaire class and by corporate power that tends to provide very limited choice. Of course, with folks on the squad, and more recently, we have some really inspiring candidates across the country, but by and large, in most places, our choices have been limited for a very long time, and they continue to be very limited. And so we often, in progressive movements in racial justice organizing, we think about voting for the lesser evil or the slightly less hostile target. And then on top of that, so much of our life is subject to private and corporate power. And so it doesn't really even have very much to do with the votes with the voting that we're doing. And so that has to do with questions about work, right? The fact that employment is so underregulated in the United States, and large employers like, for example, Amazon and Walmart don't have to do very much for the people that work for them, or about land and the way that land in this country is used for and by people who are privately hoarding it rather than for the benefit of us all, right? So you can think about all of the fracking and the pipelines that are being built through indigenous lands, and that's a way in which land that does belong to indigenous people, that belongs to the public, is being used for private profit. And so when the mainstream kind of suggests that democracy is just about voting at the ballot box, it obscures all of the modes of political participation available to us and all of the different things, whether it's housing, land, workplace, et cetera, that as the public, we should be entitled to have a say in. It obscures our power and our numbers to withdraw consent, to build alternatives, to engage in all these different kinds of ways. And then on top of that, because of all these things that have kind of made the option so limited through the vote, we see this other problem, which let me just get to the slide, where even after we vote, right, we get this carceral state, right? We get this disproportionate investing, as the movement for Black Lives and a lot of the frontline organizations have documented and talked about, this massive investment in prisons, police, and jails around the country, in tools of violence, rather than the things that our communities need: healthcare, education, public infrastructure, and housing. And so rather than thinking about the narrow concept of democracy, about just going to the ballot box every 4 years, we in our movements want to think about more broadly, what does it mean for our communities to self-determine their lives? How do we create systems and avenues for people to self-determine those conditions that include the ballot box, but are not limited to that? To kind of think of the broad range of strategies and tactics that are available to us to build a world that we know that we need. And it's not just about demanding what we're demanding, but it's about how we are building power through organization, movement building, and so on. Marbre, I think it's back to you.
Awesome. So we wanted to kind of talk and dig into thinking about how do we formulate demands and kind of the spectrum of demands that would allow us both to address democracy in this country, to start to repair, to uproot, and then to replant what it would mean to have kind of democratic participation, but also, as Amna said, to zoom out, to think about democracy not just as going to the ballot box or voting, but as all the ways in which our lives are governed. And so we kind of thought about this as kind of three kind of categories of demands. And I think inside the Frontline, inside our communities, we make demands across these categories. And we see them kind of both as steps that one requires the next, but also as things that happen simultaneously. And so one is expand the franchise, two is engage in everyday democracy everywhere, and three is transform the system. And for each of these, we have to be organizing, and building power. And so really we see this both as the means to an end. We want to see these as goals, but also that in our fight for those things, we're building community and we're building power together.
Right, so let's talk a little bit more about each of these. So in terms of reforms and demands to expand the franchise, here there's an image from the Florida campaign for Amendment 4 to enfranchise people who are incarcerated, who have criminal convictions, right? So here, when you think about expanding the franchise reforms or demands, you're thinking about ways to make it so that more people can vote, and ways so that more people can more easily vote, right? So things like automatic voter registration at 18, that anyone, regardless of any criminal convictions, regardless of immigration status even, can vote, right? We've ways to kind of get more people to be able to go to the ballot box and vote, even in that narrow form of democracy, is really, really important. Similarly, you can think about efforts to stop gerrymandering, to dilute the votes, and efforts to diminish the power of money in the elections in the way that Marbre was talking about.
Secondly, we talked about kind of engaging in everyday democracy everywhere. And this, I think, is really about how do we build the muscle of governance. So the idea of democracy at its core, at its heart, is about radical self-collective governance, right? So our ability to determine outcomes for our communities, our ability to have a say in how we are governed, and governing consent. And so this is not just, as Amna said, a once every 2 years phenomenon, that it's not just presidential elections. It's in fact every single system that we are part of is governed in some ways. How do we think about engaging those systems in ways that are more democratic? And so this includes everything from land cooperatives, is what you see in the top left-hand corner. How do we control our food systems in ways that are democratic? I think that this pandemic has really called into question the ways that food systems are in fact not responsive to the needs of our people, right? And so how do we think about cooperative food systems, cooperative ownership of land, unions and work cooperatives, where we in fact have a say in, we have some self-determination in the places that we live and we work. So tenant associations, which is what you see on the lower right-hand side. Also movement organizations, right? How do we think about being engaged with and really kind of building up this muscle of governance in the organizations that we give our time, our love, our energy, and our blood and our sweat to? I think also is local politics. And so very often, as Amna said, not only is democracy flattened into voting or not voting, but it often also just includes national races and national elections. But the reality is that the school board, the DA, the sheriff races, that it is those kind of very, very small local races that often have more influence over our everyday lives. And so how do we engage these systems, engage these different institutions, and demand and create space for democratic governance, right? And so we can think, I think, about the campaigns to defund and abolish the police that really are starting with local budgets, making demands of city commissions and county commissions. Also, new jails campaigns that are doing the same, that are locating the targets at a hyper local level, right? As well as things like participatory budgeting that really allows us to engage, to not just elect somebody who then makes all the decisions on our behalf, but actually to engage in processes where you say, what do I want to spend this $5 billion on? What does my community, what does my street, what does my block actually need? And so I think this idea of engaging democracy everywhere all the time is really about how do we actually kind of think about democracy not just as this meta national system, but also as all the kind of small building blocks that make up the governance of our lives. How do we engage in each of those and create democratic spaces, right? And so it's through that practice that we hope we can have a more democratic kind of existence and more self-determination for ourselves and our communities. Next slide. The last kind of level that we talked about was around transformation of the systems. And so I assume that's what y'all are most interested in, since you picked the structural democracy reform. But how do we zoom out? Once we've kind of enfranchised more people, that more of us are having a say, once we thought about kind of more sites of struggle, more places we can actually engage this system, then how do we transform the system, right? And I think it's important to say, and I think that Amna got to this in whole kind of discussion, is before we can even talk about creating a system of governance that respects the collective self-determination of Black people, of brown people, of immigrants, of women, of queer folks, we have to talk about how we can abolish systems that make it impossible for many of us to even live, right? And so when we talk about transformative democracy reforms, we have to talk about abolishing the police, about abolishing the prison industrial complex, about healthcare for all, about decommodifying housing. So to say, in the same way that we discussed the kind of post-slavery, that if formerly enslaved people don't have a house to live in, don't have food to eat, that engaging in democracy is really an afterthought. And so I think the first kind of thing to think about is how do we actually restructure society so that folks are best equipped to come to democracy as their whole selves and to really engage in processes of self-governance, right? Otherwise, I think folks are often left without any way to actually engage because they're so concerned with just surviving. So that's the first thing, that to engage in structured democratic reforms, we have to actually engage in reforms that allow people to be their whole self, allow people to be safe, not in cages, and to be cared for. Secondly, we have to fight for ways in which the system looks and represents people differently. And so this might include the end of the Electoral College, the end of two-party systems, this winner-take-all system that literally erases huge swaths of the vote, often for Black and brown people, and even the end of the Senate or the Supreme Court. So how do we think about actually kind of re-examining these basic root institutions that we know were created to preserve white privilege, and rethink what actually would look like to expand them, to think about franchises and institutions that encourage Black, brown, immigrants, queer folks to actually self-determine their own life outcomes? What would those systems look like? And so we're going back to the drawing board and reimagining all of these systems, not taking for granted our investment in any of them, and beginning by kind of chipping away at the, like, I think most archaic of those, like the Electoral College. And I'll pass it back to Amna to think about kind of what are through lines for all of these demands.
Yeah, so one of the things I just wanted to emphasize before we turn to some questions is just, a lot of times in the mainstream discourse, like we've been talking about, the concept of democracy is completely flattened, and the concept of democracy reform or democracy movements is flattened to the idea of fighting for things like simply enfranchisement or even just making demands of electeds. But one of the things that our movements are doing right now and have done for centuries that's really, really important to remember that our communities have done is to not wait for those in power to do the things that we are asking them to do, to not wait for that other world to be built, but to kind of work together, to engage in mutual aid projects and build alternate institutions to kind of tend to the needs of people right now. And so that goes for the whole range of mutual aid projects, whether it's sharing food in your local communities, or engaging in harm reduction efforts, or in the kinds of things that even Marbre was talking about in terms of land cooperatives or kind of food co-ops, right? So there's all sorts of ways in which we have to, as we make demands, as we protest, as we file lawsuits and engage in these strategies and tactics for social change, we work now for people who are for and with people who are housing insecure, who are incarcerated, who are in deportation proceedings, to kind of build modes of solidarity so that life is more survivable for us all.
Oh, thank you so much, Amna. I think we have about 3 or 4, maybe 5 more minutes, and would love to see if folks have questions or anything that they want to offer. I think, all of us are still kind of thinking about and exploring how do we actually engage today to transform these mammoth systems, right? That there's such deep roots inside of slavery, so old, so historic, and so huge, and how do we actually kind of engage them in a real way, right? I think that that's a real question for us to be examining and thinking about. But would love if folks do have any thoughts or any questions to share them. And I don't know, in the meantime, I think it might be worth saying that I think some of the kind of thinking about demands is also about kind of radically imagining a different society. That when we talk about a structured different democracy, it's a different way for all of us to really engage with the institutions that control our lives. And so, as Amna said, many of those are actually now private institutions. And so, how do we bring those back into public control? But thinking through, like, what are all of the different systems that we interact with that we feel powerless inside of, and how do we begin to empower ourselves to collectively govern them, to think about how we engage them differently. I don't know, Amna, if you have any reflections or thoughts you want to share while we're waiting for comments.
Yeah, I mean, in hearing you talk, the thing that occurs to me is that like sometimes I think democracy feels like a little bit of a difficult frame in racial justice movements and on the left to kind of think about, in part because I think democracy is often a call of liberals and mainstream Democrats as a way to quiet our movements, right? It's kind of like, and democracy reform is a way, you know, is kind of conceptualized narrowly to encourage people to participate in the system and not to fundamentally challenge it or try to transform it. And so I think part of the reason why this question of how our movements should rethink democracy and push you know, and engage in democratic projects is kind of a project of reimagining what democracy is about, reimagining how we want to work together, how we can work together to build a more survivable, sustainable now and future. And I think that's really hard work to try to figure out how to do that. I think we have a lot of models and people who are working on it, whether it's about, you know, the worker strikes across the country or the protests of the last several years or the mutual aid projects that we've been talking about. And I think those collective projects that have, in the way that all the Frontlines organizations have kind of connected these projects to get out the vote efforts and democracy reform, that feels like a really important place to kind of think about, because ultimately, like, you know, our movements and our efforts are not just to ratify the system or to like make the Democratic Party better, because we know that those institutions are not going to lead to, for example, you know, sustainable relationship with the land or the planet, or to the end of prisons and police. We have to kind of put in the work and build the institutions, and you know, in order to kind of see the change that we want to see. And so, how to reconceptualize democracy and kind of democratic structural reform as a way to transform rather than re-legitimate, I think is a important question. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
I see some comments and I'll read them out. I just amen to all that. I also, and I think you said this earlier too, around thinking about democracy is also inclusive of protest, that part of our work to engage democracy is also to engage in protest. So just wanted to name that. And this is great. We have one comment that says, there is already a movement for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, which, as if folks don't know, essentially is a Supreme Court case that allows money as speech, and so allows kind of unlimited amounts of money inside of politics. And getting money out of politics, AKA campaign finance reform. It is called WOLF, W-O-L-F, PAC, P-A-C. Thus, it would be good to see how to incorporate the work they are already doing and to push the momentum for structural change. Thank you so much for that comment, and also shouting out an organization that's doing dope work. And then why defund police instead of applying new funds to social agencies to remove social work from police responsibility? And thank you for this question too. I think this is a really good question and a point of kind of common misconception that defund the police is about funding other ways to deal with safety. And the reality is that as long as we have police who are empowered to use violence against people, we will see folks with mental health issues. We will see folks who are in situations of oppression being even further oppressed and often meeting violent ends because of the police. And so I think the defund demand encompasses the invest divest demand. It's saying defund the police so that we can fund things that actually keep us safe, things like social services, things like healthcare, things like medical care, things like psychological services. And so I think it's a really good question, but there's this kind of misconception that when we say defund, we don't also mean fund things that keep us safe. And I think that the reality is that police cannot exist alongside institutions that are healthy and thriving, that the history of policing in this country, much like the history of democracy, is one fraught by racism, by slave patrols, by suppression of unions and workers. And so the reality is that the demand for more police cannot coexist with the demand for safer communities that are not being policed, that are not being, that the kind of number one investment is not around policing. I don't know, Amna, if you have more to say about the defund and the invest divest kind kind of question.
Yeah, I think we were just using I was using defund as a shorthand for all of the range of abolitionist demands, strategies, and tactics, but particular demands on the state to take money. And even, Marbre was talking about participatory budgeting in people's budgets. A lot of those efforts have also been in the same vein to take money out of police budgets and put them into things that our communities want and need, like housing and healthcare and public infrastructure.
Absolutely. And so in many ways, I think it's the same thing. When we say invest, divest, with like investing in our communities and our safety and imagining safety beyond policing, I think is a lot like imagining democracy in a different way as well. I think we're almost out of time, but I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but appreciate both of these, both around kind of how do we think about products without money in them? And then also how do we think about wider cause for kind of a radical restructuring of society that goes along with democratic institutions restructuring. Amna, do you have any last words before we have to hop?
No, I think we're at time. This was really great. And it's nice to be here with everyone. And I learned so much from listening to you as always, Marbre.
Same, thank you. And thank you all for the comments.